Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn, Spiritual Leadership for a Climate Changed World. Climate change is no longer the scientific community's prediction for the future. We are now living in a climate changed world. And that can be unsettling and overwhelming, to say the least. But recognizing the spiritual roots of the climate crisis can help us navigate this new reality and advance a spiritual response. Alan Ewing-Merrill is with us today to explore these ideas. Alan serves as executive director of the BTS Center, a nonprofit foundation that builds on the legacy of the former Bangor Theological Seminary. Although no longer a degree awarding institution, today the BTS Center seeks to catalyze spiritual imagination with enduring wisdom for transformative faith leadership by offering theologically grounded programs of continuing education and spiritual and vocational formation. Thanks so much for joining us, Alan. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Director of Policy and Partnerships at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 10,000 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. A few technical notes for today. We will hear from Alan first and then tackle questions in the Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait though. You can send questions to me through the chat whenever they occur to you. I will keep track of your questions and ask them of Alan at the end. If you have any technical difficulties today, you can message Chess Gundrum. She will help you out. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, where you can also find recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns. Thank you again for joining us. And Alan, I will turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's great to be with you, Kathleen and Will and Chess and everybody from Maine Conservation Voters. I just want to thank you for this invitation. And I'm just really looking forward to sharing with you a little bit about how we, who are part of the BTS Center team, are thinking about the climate crisis. You set that up really well, Kathleen. Thanks for everyone who's joined us here today. It's great to see some familiar faces in the room and really wonderful to see a lot of new faces too. I know there are lots of places you could be on this chilly Friday afternoon, like, for example, braving the aisles at Hannaford to stock up on the last loaf of bread and the last gallon of milk before the big snowstorm that's about to hit. But really glad that you have decided to show up in this Zoom room and delighted that we can spend this hour together. So first, I just want to acknowledge that some of you may have come with some presumptions or presuppositions. It's possible that spiritual leadership is not the first thing that comes to mind when you think about the climate crisis. Fair enough. I want to acknowledge also there are lots of different kinds of spiritual leadership. Some of them contribute to positive solutions to the great challenges of the world. And frankly, some of them cause a lot of harm. And so I just want to begin by acknowledging that. When I talk about spiritual leadership, I always want to establish a kind of baseline. And for me, that has to be leadership that is rooted in love, leadership that is rooted in an expansive, inclusive, compassionate, peace-loving, justice-seeking love. And if it's not that, it's not the spiritual leadership that I'm talking about. I also want to acknowledge that some of you who are in the room today may have experienced the kind of judgmental or exclusive, shame-centered brand of spiritual leadership, which is absolutely not the kind of spiritual leadership that this moment demands. I find meaning and purpose and identity within the Christian faith. Just want to name that. I'm a pastor. I consider myself to be progressive. I have a background in multi-faith community organizing and social justice. I'm always grateful for interreligious and interspiritual conversation and collaboration. And I honor whatever spiritual path or religious identity you may bring to this conversation, including none at all. It's all good. So first I want to share my screen and share a little bit about the BTS Center, just kind of by way of background. Thumbs up if you can see my screen okay. All good? I'm not seeing, yes, I see some thumbs, excellent. And I'm navigating with an iPad. I don't have two screens here, so I'm navigating between sharing my screen and an iPad. I hope that works okay. The BTS Center is the missional successor to the former Bangor Theological Seminary, as Kathleen shared. Founded in 1814, the BTS Center was for 200 years an institution of higher education located in Bangor, as you might guess, and focused really intently on educating pastors for ministry in Protestant churches, especially Congregational United Church of Christ congregations in New England, really focused on that singular mission. It's a long and really interesting history that I won't share today of this scrappy institution that always found a way to really stick with its mission, and was really oriented to the practice of ministry, not oriented to the academy like Yale and Harvard Divinity School and Boston University were, but really, and not oriented to the ivory tower at all, but really oriented to the on-the-ground grassroots practice of ministry. In 2013, which was the 200th year of the Bangor Seminary, all that came to a screeching halt. The religious landscape had been shifting for a while. The economics of higher education were getting more and more challenging. The student enrollment had been declining for several decades. And the board of trustees of the seminary made what was a really painful, heart-wrenching decision to stop all of that. They had already sold their campus as one effort towards sustainability. They had moved on to the Husson campus, but to liquidate their library, to dismiss their faculty, to suspend all courses, and basically to stop being a seminary. And I just want to name that was a really painful, hard decision, and it was painful for everyone who was connected with the seminary's life, the faculty, the student body, the alumni, and shifted at that time into what we're now calling the BTS Center. So today we are a staff of 6, plus some consultants and contractors. We have an office on India Street in Portland. That's our office there on the left. And our mission is to catalyze spiritual imagination with enduring wisdom for transformative faith leadership. We spend a lot of time thinking about those 3 phrases: to catalyze spiritual imagination with enduring wisdom for transformative faith leadership. And there's a lot to say about all of those. Today, we are really focused on spiritual leadership for a climate changed world. We've recently adopted this as our organizational tagline, and it's intentionally provocative. It's meant to be a bit provocative. For one thing, we're using climate changed in the past tense, and using it in kind of a way that the former English teacher in me kind of makes me scratch my head a little bit. Climate changed world. Suggesting that, climate change is not something off in the future, it's here and now. It is a primary characteristic of the world in which we are living. A lot of times, I think, especially for those of us who have a lot of privilege, it's easy to just live our lives and go through our days without thinking much about climate devastation. And that's kind of a problem. I also want to suggest that it's a primary characteristic of the context in which spiritual leaders are leading today. And yet, it often doesn't register as such for spiritual leaders. That also is kind of a problem, and that's why we're really focused as we are. So I suspect if you're here today, you are paying attention to and concerned about the climate crisis. It is the greatest existential threat that humanity has ever faced. It is an all hands on deck moment. Every sector has to come together in this moment. We owe it to our children and our grandchildren. So here we are in the cold and snow of winter, so it might be easy to forget what summer was like, but this past summer, 1 in 3 Americans was personally impacted by the climate crisis. Just think about that for a minute. And this is just one country. 1 in 3 Americans. Out of control fires, we're seeing those even now. floods, drought, extreme heat, devastating storms. Probably many of you know that the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 95, 96, 98% of the oceans on the planet, depending on who's measuring. And yet we are the ones with tremendous privilege, which means that we also have tremendous responsibility. As you probably know, it's really just a handful of the wealthiest countries in the world. China's number one, the United States is number two, who contribute the lion's share of greenhouse gas emissions. Meanwhile, those who have contributed the least to the challenge are bearing the biggest burden. I'm thinking about people who live in poverty all over the world, including in this country, our Black and brown siblings, indigenous communities, people in developing countries where literally land is disappearing into the sea, people who are unable to grow the crops that have sustained their communities for generations. They just don't grow anymore. And so we see this incredible rise in what is often called climate refugees. This past August, the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a body of the United Nations, released its 6th report. Maybe some of you have seen a summary of it, detailing the most up-to-date understandings of the climate system and climate change, and it's devastating. So I'm going to share my screen again and just flip through a few of the headlines that came out in August, soon after that report was released. So here's just a few headlines. Humans have pushed the climate into unprecedented territory, landmark UN report finds. A hotter future is certain, climate panel warns, but how hot is up to us. The Earth is warming faster than previously thought, scientists say, and the window is closing to avoid catastrophic outcomes, and there are more. This one claims we are out of time. Climate change is real and it's permanent. A sobering read from the IPCC, sobering for sure. So we know what's happening. There is clear consensus. Climate change is real, it's accelerating, it's caused by human behavior, and the window of time when we can address it is closing. We must act now so that we can feel hopeful, not the other way around. The extraction and burning of fossil fuels has resulted in a warming climate, in a warming planet. Globally, temperatures are increasing, ice sheets in the Arctic are shrinking, glaciers are retreating. Sea levels are rising at an accelerating pace, causing more frequent flooding that threatens coastal communities and even forces some residents of low-lying islands to relocate. There are places in the world where communities are actually making the decision, where are we going to go? Meanwhile, the ocean is acidifying, causing coral reefs to bleach and die and causing the shells of marine life to crumble. People around the globe are experiencing more frequent extreme weather events, more intense hurricanes, unpredictable winter storms, disastrous drought in some places, and equally disastrous rainstorms in other places. While devastating wildfires on the West Coast of the United States, in the Amazon, in Australia, and so many other places are destroying habitats and ravaging forests that sequester carbon. This last point is really important because as the fires burn, the carbon that is stored in the trees combusts, which releases the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide back into the atmosphere, which further intensifies the cycle of warming. So climate scientists are in agreement that we are destroying ecosystems, and all of this is having a devastating impact for human beings and other species with whom we share this fragile planet. According to a recent report from Oxfam, climate-fueled disasters force at least 20 million people a year to leave their homes. That's equivalent to one person fleeing every 2 seconds. And that trend is likely to continue, with the numbers of climate refugees increasing as the ecological emergency intensifies and portions of the planet essentially become unlivable. uninhabitable. What about non-humans? Scientists tell us that 2/3 of bird species in North America are at risk of extinction as global temperatures continue to rise. 2/3 of bird species in North America. More than 40% of insect species are in decline and 1/3 are endangered. This is so severe, scientists sometimes talk about what they call an insect apocalypse. So we might say, it's only insects and birds. But of course, the loss of insects and birds threatens agriculture in significant ways, which has a devastating ripple effect across the food chain. There's a recent article in the New Yorker entitled Climate Change and the New Age of Extinction, which warned that almost 1 million species are at risk of extinction, many within decades. Some say we are in the midst of the 6th Great Extinction. There's a book by that title. I want to say this clearly too, though, and that is that we tend to look at all of this from a very anthropocentric place, which means human beings at the center or at the top, right? That it's all about us. But the truth is that all other life forms in the natural world, our more than human kin, sometimes I call them, have inherent worth all by themselves, independent of their worth for human beings. I think that's really important for us to acknowledge. And besides that, human beings are not separate from nature. We think we are. We think we're somehow, there's us and then there's nature. But actually, we are part of nature. We are nature. And I think if we can begin from that place, it changes the way we think about all of this. One climate expert, Robert Watson, who chairs the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, has said, "What is at stake here is a livable world." What is at stake here is a livable world. Okay, I'm going to pause there for a second and invite us all to take a deep breath. Because all that I just ran through is kind of heavy. And it's no wonder that we turn away. It's a lot to bear, isn't it? It's a lot to bear. I don't know about you, but I find it's essential and maybe even a little bit liberating to name the truth, to put it all out there and acknowledge it for what it is. The truth is very heavy. But for me, what's worse than confronting all of the heaviness of it is denying it. What's worse than confronting it is denying it. There's nothing at all hopeful about burying our heads in the sand. And also just to know, I have delineated the challenge here and I've spelled it out. But I also believe that human beings are created with incredible imaginative capacity, imaginative abundance. And so this is a moment when we need to tap into it. And there are some challenges to this because those who study the brain tell us that in the moments when we most need to tap into our imaginative capacity, those are moments when we are generally experiencing some kind of crisis. And in crisis, our bodies move into stress mode, and the part of our brain that actually controls imagination doesn't work so well. Like we move into fight or flight mode, which is the amygdala in our brain, right? And so we know how to run out of a burning building. But when there's a crisis that's more slow moving and coming, but we aren't experiencing the flames at our heels, we sometimes have a hard time moving into imagination space because that part of our brain is hard to access when we're stressed. Okay, another deep breath. Another deep breath. And what I find is helpful in moments like this, when we're confronting the heaviness of the truth, is to also access the practice of gratitude. Because even though there's much that is challenging, to say the least, there also is much for which we can be grateful for. So I just want to invite you to take a minute and think about something for which you are grateful today. Just hold that before you. Maybe pretend that you have your hands open like this and imagine that thing for which you are grateful, and in your mind, hold it in your hands for a moment. It's never either hellscape or utopia. It's always some mix, right? There are many things for which we can be grateful today. So, spiritual leadership for a climate changed world. I have focused a lot on the climate changed world. Now I'm going to shift and talk a little bit about spiritual leadership. Why spiritual leadership? Because I believe that this is at its core a spiritual crisis. As a species, we have lost our way. Very often we start with the symptoms and we think, okay, how can we fix this? But it seems to me before we move into fix it mode, we have to have an honest diagnosis. How did we get here? What we're trying to do here, and this is the BTS Center's kind of focus, is to look underneath the climate crisis at root causes. The crisis is a symptom of something else, which is fundamentally wrong with the way our society is functioning. In many ways, I think the COVID pandemic has been enlightening, apocalyptic in the true sense of that word. That word apocalyptic really just means an unveiling or a pulling back the curtain. And the pandemic has sort of pulled back the curtain and allowed us to see things about the way our civilization functions that are a little distressing. So there's something going on, and it's not just the climate crisis, it's something that the climate crisis is a symptom of. And so this invites us to apply a critical lens and invite us into deeper reflection, which then leads to action. I'm going to share my screen again and share one of my favorite quotes that every single person who is associated with the BTS Center in any way has heard many, many times, because I feel like I quote this all the time. But these are words from an environmentalist by the name of Gus Speth, actually James Gustav Speth. And he has written, I used to think the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address these problems. Well, guess what? We've had more than 30 years of good science, and we haven't addressed the problem fully. So he says, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation. I happen to believe he is correct. But then he ends this little quote by saying, and we scientists don't know how to do that. I think this is important because while cultural and spiritual transformation may not be within the purview of the science community, they certainly should be within the purview of the faith community, of the spiritual community. Gus Speth is not alone. Here's a quote that goes all the way back to 1967. I'll just say this was before I was born. This is more than 50 years ago when Lynn Townsend White Jr. wrote, more science and more technology are not going to get us out of the present ecological crisis until we find a new religion or rethink our old one. I think it's amazing that he said this more than 50 years ago. It feels very contemporary to me. Until we find a new religion or rethink our old one. So I want to just say for a moment, we do need all the good science. This is not about science denial for me, but science is not enough. Science is not going to get us as far as we need to go here, because the climate crisis is fundamentally a spiritual crisis that is rooted, as Gus Speth says, in selfishness, greed, and apathy. I heard him speak a few weeks ago, and he also added the word pride there. Selfishness, greed, apathy, pride, which manifests in this pernicious cycle of domination, extraction, and consumption. If you think about it, that's the cycle we're in. Domination, extraction, consumption. The lie that we have been fed by this extractive capitalism that we experience is that the sole purpose in life is to consume more. And so that leads us into this cycle, domination, extraction, consumption. We experience a profound sense of disconnection from one another, from the earth, from our more than human kin, from the divine, and even from our own sacred center. These are spiritual issues. So the solutions have to be spiritual solutions, it seems to me, transformational solutions that get at the root of the problem. And also, just to note, I think these solutions have to be intersectional in nature. That is, the climate crisis is deeply connected to white supremacy, to heteropatriarchy, to colonialism, and all of the other social injustices of our world, they're all interrelated. They're not separate things, but they're manifestations of the same thing. And so we are trying to be focused at the intersection of spiritual leadership and the climate crisis. Just to say a word about what we're doing with the BTS Center, we're not trying to be a faith-rooted environmental advocacy group. We need those. There are a lot of those. We need good public policy, and there are people doing that kind of work from a faith perspective. We're also not trying to advocate for congregations to assess their carbon footprint and be more green. Of course, congregations and all of us should be doing that, right? Congregations should form a green team. They should recycle and compost and change their light bulbs and encourage people to move to electric cars and install solar panels on their roof. That is all good. That's just not the lane that we're trying to focus on. We're trying to apply a transformational lens. That is to approach this not as a technical problem that requires a technical fix, but as an adaptive challenge. I'm using the language of adaptive leadership here, an adaptive systemic challenge that is thoroughly systemic, that requires an honest assessment and adaptive solutions, which is of course harder work than forming a green team and putting solar panels on your roof and declaring it done. We do not profess to have all the answers. We are very interested in these big questions. So to get specific, some of the things we're doing, public conversations. For example, we led a conversation with the editors of this book called All We Can Save. I hope some of you have encountered this book, Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis. This is a collection, it's a thick collection of essays written by women authors. They're all women from many different walks of life, including Indigenous voices, and declaring that actually most of the solutions that we need are going to come from women, not from men. As the father of 3 daughters, I wholeheartedly concur. So public conversations. We had a conversation a while back with Robin Wall Kimmerer, who some of you may know, the author of Braiding Sweetgrass. If you've not read this book, I highly recommend it. Robin Wall Kimmerer is a biologist, ecologist, member of the Potawatomi Nation. And this is a fantastic collection of Indigenous wisdom, scientific knowledge, and the teachings of plants. Last spring, we had a series focused on imagination. That's a word right out of our mission statement, focusing on the work of Rob Hopkins, who's an environmental activist and leader of the UK-based Transition Network, and the author of this book, From What Is to What If, Unleashing the Power of Imagination to Create the Future We Want. This book is written from the secular perspective, as are the other 2 that I shared, I guess. I mean, what's the line between secular and sacred? I'm never really sure, but there's so much in here that resonates. And we had a cohort of spiritual leaders who came together over 3 months to ask big what if questions and explore how they might spark imagination within their congregations and communities. This past fall, we had a multifaceted series focused on eco-grief, acknowledging that for many, this is a time of grieving what is being lost. And that included online ritual, public conversations, book groups, and lots of other things. We're trying to do a lot with faith leader formation. So cohorts, learning communities, workshops, retreats, spiritual and vocational formation, and always broadly construed. Big definition of spiritual leader, not a narrow definition. For example, coming up on February 24th, we're looking forward to a day-long online retreat guided by eco-justice poet Lillis Mellon Ginyard, who's going to be helping us think about poetry and nature. And then we have a major applied research project, which is a cross-sector group of leaders from 8 different organizations from around Northern New England who are together asking the question over the 18 months, asking the question, how would organizations function differently today if they embodied an ecological imagination? That is, thinking about organizations not as machines with inputs and outputs, but as organisms, just changing the way we think about that. And actually that research collaborative is in a day-long retreat today that I just stepped away from for this. So recently I've been working to articulate 4 aims, and this is not a definitive list, but it's kind of a working hypothesis. And I'm just going to run through these with you, and then we'll move into a time of question and answer. First is to challenge faith leaders and people of faith to reclaim and proclaim our interdependent connection with the natural world as a central focus of our faith. To reclaim and proclaim our interdependent connection with the natural world as a central focus of our faith. So this means that human beings have to reject the disaster capitalist colonizing ideology that assigns dominance to human beings and adopt what one theologian calls a cosmic humility. That is acknowledging and honoring that we are interdependent with all living things and with the earth itself, and accept our place as part of and not separate from nature. Setting aside this misguided notion that we're entitled to do whatever we want with the earth because we're human beings. I think this is important because, as I said, we're here because of a sense of disconnection. We need to restore right relationship with the earth and with other living things. So some of the language that we use, here comes my critique, some of the language that we use, even in environmental activist circles, is problematic. We say things like caring for the earth or earth stewardship. I just want to name that this is anthropocentric language. These ideas that we are caring for the earth actually place human beings at the top of a hierarchy, which mischaracterizes the actual relationship. Before we assign any responsibility for caring for creation, actually the earth cares for us. We are the ones who are dependent on plants and animals of the earth to care for us. It's not actually that the earth is entrusted to us, it's that we are entrusted to the earth. So it's a flipping of that language of caring for the earth or being earth stewards. This awareness invites us into a posture of gratitude and awe, and it invites us to adopt spiritual practices that nurture a deeper sense of connection to the rest of nature. In a world of climate devastation, there is no us and them. There's just one whole and interconnected us that encompasses the entire human family. And I want to extend that out to future generations and our more than human kin. You might remember that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all of us indirectly. And I think the truth of that statement never comes into starker focus than it does when we think about where we are as a world community. We share this common home, and it's the only one we have. So that's number one. Number two is to facilitate public conversation aimed at redefining what it means to live a good life. I have mentioned this earlier, but our definition, especially in white Western society, of what it means to live the good life is fundamentally wrong. It's rooted in this idea of continual progress and irrepressible growth. The climate crisis is a symptom of that wrong thinking. Our values of individualism and consumerism have corrupted our sense of the common good. And so we're trying to facilitate public conversation that calls together clergy and other spiritual teachers, environmentalists, climate activists, poets, artists, theologians, to really center the work of communities, faith communities and other kinds of communities in justice and community and interdependence, celebrating every sign of change toward a just and sustainable global society, and then witnessing to this alternative vision for living a good life. Number three of these aims that I've been trying to articulate, to confront the intersections between climate justice and other issues of social justice. These are not separate. These are interrelated things. Climate injustice intersects with every social injustice, whether that's racial injustice, economic injustice, gender injustice, LGBTQ injustice, healthcare injustice, they're all interrelated. One of my professors in a doctoral program that I'm a part of, Dr. Larry Rasmussen, who taught at Union Seminary in New York City for many years, says it this way: if you don't have creation justice, you don't have social justice. The latter requires the former. And he says this is true because we can never have increased human well-being. We can never have human flourishing on a dying and diminishing planet. So he says that planetary health is primary and human well-being is derivative. I don't want to suggest that one is more important than the other. It's just that you can't have one without the other. If the rest of nature does not thrive, then human beings will never thrive. And so we're trying to approach the task of climate justice intersectionally, focusing on how the climate crisis intersects with other areas of oppression or injustice due to categories like gender, race, socioeconomic, class, ability, sexual orientation, and all the rest. And the fourth of these aims that I'm trying to articulate is to reorient the missional focus of faith communities. Reverend Dr. Jim Antal, who's a United Church of Christ pastor and author and climate activist, has published this book entitled Climate Church, Climate World: How People of Faith Must Work for Change. And in this book, he is suggesting that this moment demands a radical reframing of the purpose and focus of spiritual communities. He calls it a new vocation in response to the challenge that we're facing. He says the climate crisis is a theological emergency, and he suggests that God is calling the church to initiate a moral intervention, to speak with a clear, bold, truthful, and prophetic voice in a time of climate crisis. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Bill McKibben, who is also part of a United Methodist Church in Vermont. And he says that the climate crisis is an opportunity for which the church was born. I love that. An opportunity for which the church was born. And if the word church doesn't work for you, just substitute whatever kind of community you want to into that idea. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that faith communities alone are going to save the planet. That's not the goal. But for my part, I want to do what I can to provoke conversation and engage spiritual communities. And I hope that they will be inspired and challenged to be part of a movement toward reconnection and healing and justice. I'm going to share my screen one last time, and I promise we'll move to Q&A. Returning again for a moment to Gus Speth and a couple of other quotes that I want to share with you. Remember that he says the top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And in order to deal with these, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation. Totally agree. At the core of the climate crisis is a spiritual sickness. And while we do need to do some concrete things to reduce harm, we also need to look deeply within to understand what it is that has led us to this moment. The present ecological crisis is a clarion call for people of faith and goodwill, all of us, to answer the beckoning of spirit and earth, and to direct our energies, our prayers, our fervent action, and our deepest commitments to the plight of our common home. I want to be bold with Jim Antal and say, I believe that people of faith the world over have the capacity to determine the trajectory of our common future. Jürgen Moltmann, who is a German theologian, has said, if we knew with certainty that we would not survive, we would do nothing. If we knew with certainty that we would survive, we would also do nothing. Only if the future is open for both possibilities are we forced to do today what is necessary to survive tomorrow. Think about that for a minute. And then I'm going to end with some words from Joanna Macy, who speaks from the Buddhist tradition. This is from her book, Active Hope, which I highly recommend. She says, I'm not insisting that we be brimming with hope. It's okay not to be optimistic. Buddhist teachings say feeling that you have to maintain hope can wear you out. So just be present. The biggest gift you can give is to be absolutely present. And when you're worrying about whether you're hopeful or hopeless or pessimistic or optimistic, who cares? The main thing is that you're showing up, that you're here, and that you're finding ever more capacity to love this world, because it will not be healed without that. That is what is going to unleash our intelligence and our ingenuity and our solidarity for the healing of our world. So my friends, the main thing is that you're showing up, that you're here, and you did show up today, and you are here. So I commend you for that, and I look forward to some Q&A.
Alan, thank you. I want to take a moment to just take a breath and thank you for really profoundly moving and thoughtful presentation this morning. I'm so grateful. And I can see lots of nodding heads. It feels wonderful to be in community with all of you this morning. And you all, many of you know that at this point in the program, we always share a call to action. And I know lots of us were frantically writing down book titles. I promise that reading list will be in our follow-up email later this afternoon, along with a couple of other suggestions on how we might each take on spiritual practices that nurture a deeper sense of connection with the natural world. And of course, the headline for this part of the call to action is that that's going to be individual to each of us, and what feels right for us, what practices fit with our own traditions, and where we are right now are going to be unique, and that's appropriate. So it may be a long walk in the woods. It may be some time with a sketchbook and a set of colored pencils. It may be hugging a tree in your backyard. But there are some other ideas too, like a practice of a sit spot. This is a form of active meditation, and we're going to include a link to this so you have a little bit more background, see if it feels right for you. And the BTS Center really does have just an incredible library of resources and phenomenal programming. A newsletter that always makes me stop and take a breath. And Alan, I especially appreciate the poems that you share in that newsletter, and I'm so excited for that day-long eco-justice poetry workshop. We'll have a link to that as well. But I really just encourage you all to poke around and keep this conversation going. I know I'm already thinking about all the people I want to talk to and send this recording to when it's done. But let's get into some questions and comments, because there really are some terrific ones, and thank you all for sharing. Let's start off with this one. Historically, we have heard the voices of certain theologians to rally our societal awareness. So we just recently marked and took a moment to commemorate the work of Martin Luther King Jr. BTS Center did an absolutely phenomenal program there, but there are so many more people. Who do you hear right now speaking as public theologians on the issue of climate crisis and climate action?
So I want to first expand the definition of theologian. Sometimes we think this is, the theologians that get most airtime are mostly white Western old dudes. I'm just going to say that. And we need to expand beyond that. So a theologian, in my mind, is anybody who thinks about God or thinks about the divine. So some of the best theologians, in my mind, are those young adults in the Sunshine Movement and some of the incredible movements of young people. They may not think that they're theologians. In my mind, they are theologians. They are thinking about divine things. I also think about Indigenous voices. We were honored to have with us for our annual convocation, not in 2021, but in 2020, Sherry Mitchell. And I'm gonna see if I can find her amazing book. Yeah, right here. I'm throwing books around at you all. Sorry about that. But if you have not picked up Sacred Instructions, Indigenous Wisdom for Living Spirit-Based Change by Sherry Mitchell, who's right here in Maine, Penobscot leader here in Maine. This is a phenomenal book. And I'm not sure Sherry Mitchell would deem herself a theologian. She's a theologian. She is a theologian. I am aware that a lot of the quotes that I shared today are we're some of those white Western old dudes. So I want to acknowledge that. But I have just read a book by Jürgen Moltmann called The Spirit of Hope. And his voice in the first half of that book is really important. The authors of this book, All We Can Save, some of them coming from theological perspectives, all women voices, really, really important. And what was the other one that I was thinking about? I guess I'll stop there. There's a few. There's many more, though.
I love that expansive view of who a theologian is. And it really, I think, opens up for many of us who, as you said at the beginning, might have complicated relationships with organized religion.
Let me add one more.
Yeah, please do.
You know, when Jesus was asked about this, he said, look at the birds. Look at the birds of the air, observe them. So I'm going to suggest that the birds are the theologians we need at this moment as well.
I love that. I love that. I also love that book, All We Can Save. There are a bunch that you shared that are on my to read list, but that's one that I have read and loved. And we've got some folks on the call today who are in the same place. And there are some really incredible resources at that All We Can Save site about sort of shared reading groups. So we have one participant today who's been active in a reading group for All We Can Save and shared just a sentiment I think we can probably all relate to, that they're often getting distracted by what she called the whack-a-mole number of urgent problems in our communities. How do we keep from getting overwhelmed and really build that trust that as each of us do our piece of this work, we will find others doing their piece of the work? Do you have any advice for us on that?
Well, first I'll just say it's okay to be overwhelmed at times, right? That's the human experience. We're all overwhelmed at times. But for me, it comes back to community and practice. So where is your community, you know, that you can be real with? For me, it's my faith community. I'm part of a community called Hope Gateway. I'm really grateful for that community, and they keep me grounded, you know, being on a good day or on a not so good day. And then practices, you know, what are the practices, spiritual practices, but again, expansive view of the spiritual practice that keep you grounded. And you named some of them a few moments ago, Kathleen, the walk in the woods, the watching the birds, the, you know, taking on the practice of a sit spot. I think we have to take on practices that allow us to engage with others. Margaret Wheatley has a book that's called Who Do We Want to Be? I think is the title. And in that book, she talks about the importance of creating islands of sanity. And I love this idea. She says that this is actually how real change happens. It's not top down, you know, it's not top down legislative solutions generally that lead to systemic change. It's bottom up. And that our work is to create islands of sanity, to create an island of sanity, right? There's always going to be insanity all around us. And she wrote this in the midst of the Trump administration, and that comes through, I think. But to create an island of sanity, and then to fan the flames of other islands of sanity and to be connected with one another. And that's how real change happens, is by the multiplying ripple effect of islands of sanity. I find that to be a really comforting idea. We can't take it all on, but we can do our part in the sphere where we have influence.
That is just so helpful. And I wonder if it might help answer one of the other questions that we have in the chat, which is, as a preacher's daughter, I'm curious if you ever feel like you're preaching to the choir. And I wonder if that idea of islands of sanity means it's okay to preach to the choir sometimes. The choir needs a good song every once in a while.
We talk about this a lot on our staff team and use this phrase, preaching to the choir. And as one of my colleagues reminds me often, the choir needs good preaching too. But we are always thinking about how do we reach beyond the choir as well? Like how do we, I think about, and I had a private message chat to me with a question related to this too. There are the intractable naysayers who are stuck in climate denial and, you know, all of the things. And I have no idea what to do with that. I have no idea. But then there's the movable middle. There's the people who understand that climate crisis is real, but maybe it hasn't risen to the level of urgency for them. They don't know exactly what to do. I tend to focus on, if you think about sort of the choir is at the center, and then there are concentric circles that go out from there. I'm not going to go from the choir at the center to the most outer ring of, climate deniers. I'm going to try to sort of like gradually move concentric circles and talk with the people who really could come around. And we're thinking about this particularly around, so we have the people who always show up for our programs, but we really want to think about small church, small congregational leadership, in small communities around Northern New England where they aren't talking about the climate crisis. So how do we reach in there and provoke a conversation that is accessible, that they can really access, so that we're not just talking about sort of ivory tower ideas. And that's something we're thinking about. I don't have the answers yet, but working on. I don't know if that answers the question or not.
No, I think it does. And I think it's really heartening to think about those faith communities that are not yet engaged in this work, but are primed for it. And one of our participants noted that so often we associate religion in America with the Bible Belt and red states, and right. that is a way that we have framed what it means to be a person of faith in America as society-wide. And you're sharing a very different concept, and I wonder what you see in your interactions with faith leaders. Is there a truth in between those two extremes? Or
it's a whole trajectory, right? From very conservative, Bible Belt, and to very progressive, and everything in between. It happens that people on the right, faith leaders on the right, tend to be loudest. They have the biggest platforms. They have the microphone very often. And that's unfortunate, because there is a tremendously gifted, passionate, intelligent, justice-seeking, progressive wing. And it's here in Maine, and it's everywhere. I want to point to the Maine Council of Churches for one. Jane Field is with us here today, and the Maine Council of Churches is focused on building a culture of compassion, justice, and peace in this state, and doing incredible work with, is it 6 member denominations? Thumbs up, is that right, Jane? Is it 7? 7 member denominations and some affiliate churches, doing incredible work in Augusta and all over, trying to do that work. I also see Doretta Colburn here, and she's doing incredible work with her little congregation in Western Maine, sparking climate conversations. I see Steve Hill from the Cape Elizabeth United Methodist Church. They're doing incredible work engaging that little congregation in this work of really attending to the climate crisis. So it's happening everywhere. They're just not on Fox News or CNN. They're doing it quietly, but they're doing the work, and they're showing up. And it's not just Christians, of course. I mentioned Joanna Macy, who is an incredible voice from the Buddhist perspective. There are incredible Jews and Muslims and people of all different faith traditions, and none at all that are doing this work. Oh yeah, someone's put in the chat, Musan, the Maine Unitarian Universalist Social Action Network, the Episcopal Network for Justice. I mean, there are many. And someone is private chatting me, to be fair, some conservative churches attending to the climate crisis too, although we don't hear about them much. And I'm sure that is true, and that's gratifying. There is a group of young evangelicals for climate justice or something like that, that is doing really good work as well. Yeah, so I think the danger is to paint with too broad a brushstroke, and to settle into stereotypes, because I mean, in some ways stereotypes arise for a reason, but there's plenty that defies the stereotypes.
And it's so interesting to think that a theological perspective could perhaps be a uniter rather than a divider, because
wouldn't that be nice?
it seems rather revolutionary until you realize, well, actually, perhaps it's the most basic thing of all.
Well, the word religion actually means, if you think about and then ligio, which is connected with ligament, to reconnect. The work of true religion is to reconnect. But what we have settled into, and I'm stealing a concept from Victoria Loers, who wrote this book. Yeah, I have a stack of books here, can you tell? This book called Church of the Wild, How Nature Invites Us into the Sacred. In this book, she talks about what we have actually is disligion or disligio. You know, it's religion too often disconnects us, but the real meaning of that word is to reconnect. So what if the role of religion was to reconnect, you know, the places that are broken? That's what we should be doing. And by the way, we're going to be leading so here's my little pitch, because you gave me a chance. We're going to be leading a study, what are we calling it? A learning community or something like that. Community of practice, based on this book, Church of the Wild, How Nature Invites Us into the Sacred by Victoria Loers. That's starting, I think, in March. It's not even on our website yet. But reading the book together and discussing it, this is kind of like it's sort of a spiritual memoir meets theology, but I think you'd find it accessible regardless of what tradition. She's really pushing, she is Christian, but she's pushing against the ways in which Christianity has been a barrier to her own sense of calling and vocation in connection with the natural world. So I just invite you to consider that and watch for that group.
So Alan, your homework after this program is to snap a
Send you the
picture of
book
that
list.
stack of books, and I'll transcribe them so we can share them out. But I couldn't catch them all. And
no, I don't. How could you?
Yeah, and everyone else. I mean, it sounds like if you haven't signed up for the BTS Center's newsletter already, give it a go. I have a feeling that I speak for a lot of us when I say I wish that this program was extending for the rest of the day and the rest of the blizzard ahead and all of that. But thank you for giving us so much good food for thought. And maybe we can all rush to the library this afternoon to get some good reading material to see us through the next couple of days too. Alan, I am so grateful to you for this time. I so appreciate all of you who joined, and thank you for your really thoughtful comments and questions. We could talk all day, but we will meet each other again and continue to make this space. We'll also be back in this space again next week to learn about some resources from the Smithsonian Science Education Center that support young people to understand and then to act on pressing issues. They've got a series of curriculum guides. We're going to explore the brand new one on environmental justice with Smithsonian curriculum developer Heidi Gibson. So I hope you can join us. We'll include information about that in the follow-up email, along with a whole bunch of other ideas, reading lists, and the recording. As I said, can't wait to share it with everybody I know. So I invite you to do the same. And thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day and a wonderful blizzard. Stay warm.